Connor Hayes carried CEO Evelyn Carter through the emergency room doors after a steel frame collapsed on her in the executive garage, never expecting what came next. Minutes later, a nurse called his name into the crowded hallway. Evelyn, a woman famous for keeping every employee at arm's length, had woken from the pain and written his name into the box marked emergency contact. Connor stood frozen while the leadership team waited outside, watching the quiet single father the CEO had chosen above all of them. But the real reason Evelyn trusted only him was far more dangerous than any accident. If you want to know why Evelyn trusted only Connor, stay with this story until its final moment. The story began on a Friday afternoon at the headquarters of Evermont Medical Systems. Connor Hayes had just finished a routine safety inspection in the manufacturing wing when a warning came through about a faulty sensor in the executive parking garage. He gathered his tools without complaint the way he did every task and made his way down toward the lower level. Connor was the kind of employee most senior leaders never noticed. He skipped the company parties, never chased credit for his work, and left the building at a reasonable hour, so he could return to the life he had built as a widowed single father. His wife had died years earlier, and since then he had learned to live with quiet order, work, responsibility, family, and nothing that threatened the balance he had fought to create. He was not looking for anything more, and he certainly never imagined he had anything in common with the chief executive of the company. Evelyn Carter occupied a completely different world. She ran a corporation worth billions of dollars, appeared regularly in business publications, and had built a reputation for making difficult decisions without flinching. To most employees, Evelyn seemed distant, almost unreachable. But Connor had seen a different version of her a few times, the version that stayed in the office long after everyone else had gone home, walked the production floor herself, and somehow remembered the names of technicians that other executives never bothered to learn. They knew each other by sight and by reputation, but they had never been close, and neither of them had reason to expect that would change. That afternoon, Connor made his way to the garage to inspect the faulty sensor. On the far side of the level, Evelyn had just finished a tense exchange with her chief operating officer, Adrian Cole. Connor caught only a fragment of it as he approached, Evelyn's voice low and controlled but unmistakably firm. "Do not take this to the board until I have enough proof," she said. Adrian turned and walked away without answering. Evelyn straightened her jacket and started toward her car, her expression composed again, as though the conversation had never happened. Connor kept working, telling himself it was none of his concern. But something about the tightness in her voice stayed with him, a small unease he could not quite explain, the kind of feeling that years of safety inspections had taught him never to ignore. Connor had worked at Evermont long enough to understand the rhythms of the building, the way tension moved through departments before anyone said a word about it out loud. Lately, that tension had been building around the executive floor. Quiet arguments behind closed doors, sudden changes to meeting schedules, and a general sense that something beneath the surface of the company was shifting. He had no interest in office politics and had always kept himself apart from it, focused instead on the parts of the job that mattered to him, making sure nothing in the building could hurt the people who worked there. He checked his equipment one more time before heading toward the maintenance corridor near the far end of the garage, running through the report in his mind, already planning how he would document the faulty sensor and close it out before the weekend. It was the kind of small, unremarkable task that filled most of his days, the sort of work that no one thanked him for and few people even noticed, which suited him just fine. Evelyn's car was parked near the elevator bank, and Connor noted, almost without thinking about it, that she had come down to the garage alone without an assistant or a driver trailing behind her the way most executives traveled through the building. It struck him as unusual, though he did not dwell on it. He had learned over the years not to read too much into the habits of people whose lives were so different from his own. As Evelyn walked past the maintenance area, Connor heard a thin, high-pitched groan coming from somewhere above her. Years of safety training made him look up before he even understood why he was looking. A metal frame that held part of the lighting system was shaking in a way it had no business shaking. "Evelyn," he shouted, just as a section of the support frame broke loose and began to fall. Connor moved without thinking, closing the distance between them and shoving her sideways with everything he had. Most of the frame missed her, but a length of steel struck her shoulder and hip, and the impact sent her down hard onto the concrete floor. Connor dropped to his knees beside her. Evelyn was conscious but disoriented, her breath coming in short bursts, pain written clearly across her face. When she tried to push herself up, her arm gave out beneath her. His phone would not hold a signal reliably down in the garage, and rather than waste precious minutes trying to get emergency services on the line from underground, Connor made a decision. He would carry her up to street level himself where help could reach them faster. "Connor, I can walk," Evelyn said, her voice thin and unconvincing. "No," he answered. "You can't." He lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back. This was not a tender or romantic moment. It was an emergency, plain and urgent, and Evelyn gripped the front of his shirt as he moved quickly down the corridor, her breath catching with every step that jolted her injured shoulder. A security guard spotted them from the stairwell and immediately radioed for an ambulance to meet them at the entrance. While they waited, Connor noticed Evelyn fighting to stay alert, her eyelids drifting lower each time she stopped talking. He kept his voice steady and constant, refusing to let silence settle between them. "Look at me," he said. Evelyn's eyes opened again. "Stay awake," he told her. She managed a faint, pained smile. "Giving orders to a chief executive now," she murmured. "Today I am," he answered. It was the first time she had laughed with him, however briefly, but only seconds later her color drained and her expression tightened with fresh pain. The ambulance pulled up to the curb, lights flashing against the glass of the building. Connor stepped back to let the paramedics do their work. Evelyn's hand shot out and caught his wrist before he could move away. "Come with me," she said. Connor froze, caught completely off guard by the request. "Please," she repeated, quieter this time. He climbed into the ambulance beside her without another word. The ride to the hospital felt longer than it likely was. A paramedic worked quickly to stabilize her shoulder while another checked her vitals, calling out numbers that meant little to Connor, but seemed to satisfy the professionals around him. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on him the entire time, as though his presence alone was keeping something steady inside her that had nothing to do with her injuries. Connor said little during the ride, mostly because he could think of nothing useful to say. He simply stayed close, letting her grip his hand when the ambulance hit an uneven stretch of road and the pain flared sharply enough to make her wince. It was a strange position for him to be in, sitting beside the most powerful person at his company, while she clung to a near stranger for something as basic as comfort. At the hospital, doctors took Evelyn back for imaging almost immediately. Connor sat in the waiting area in a shirt still dusted with concrete and marked with a small streak of her blood, unsure of what to do with his hands or his thoughts. Less than 20 minutes later, Adrian Cole arrived with several other executives close behind him. Adrian wanted to know exactly what had happened, and Connor gave him a brief, factual account of the collapse. Adrian appeared concerned, but his questions kept circling back to strange details. Where exactly had the frame fallen from? Had Connor seen anyone near the maintenance area beforehand? What had Evelyn said before the accident occurred? Connor answered carefully, and a quiet unease began to settle over him, the same instinct that had made him look up in the garage in the first place. A nurse stepped into the waiting area. "Connor Hayes," she called. Every head in the hallway turned. Connor stood. "Are you Miss Carter's emergency contact?" the nurse asked. For a moment Connor thought he had misheard her. The nurse checked her clipboard again. "She just woke up and listed your name herself." The hallway went completely silent. Adrian's expression shifted into something Connor could not immediately read, something between suspicion and calculation. Connor was allowed a few minutes in her room. Evelyn lay in the bed with her shoulder braced and stabilized, pale but alert. Connor asked the question sitting heaviest on his mind. "Why me?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because I don't know who else at this company I can trust," she said. Connor assumed the medication was speaking for her, but Evelyn held his gaze steadily, without a trace of confusion. "What happened in the garage might not have been an accident," she said. Connor straightened, all his earlier unease rushing back at once. Evelyn told him she had spent weeks quietly investigating a series of financial irregularities tied to an equipment contract. Documents she had reviewed suggested someone inside the executive ranks was working to force her out of the company entirely. That very morning she had discovered that certain safety reports had been altered, and she had planned to review them again over the weekend. Then the frame came down. "Do you suspect Adrian?" Connor asked. She did not answer him directly. "I suspect anyone who knew I was investigating," she said instead. And Connor understood then that Evelyn had not written his name on that form out of any personal affection. It was the choice of a powerful woman who had just discovered in the worst possible way that she was entirely alone. He asked her whether she had told anyone else what she suspected. Evelyn shook her head slightly, wincing at even that small motion. Grace knew part of it, she admitted. But even Grace did not have the full picture yet, because Evelyn had not been certain who inside the legal department might report back to Adrian without meaning any harm by it. Connor sat with that for a moment, absorbing the size of what she was asking him to carry. He was not a lawyer, not an investigator, and certainly not accustomed to corporate intrigue of this kind. But he understood machinery, and he understood when something had been deliberately broken rather than simply worn down. And some instinct told him this situation was no different. Connor asked why Evelyn trusted him of all people, and her answer surprised him. Years earlier, Evermont had suffered a serious incident at one of its manufacturing plants. A vice president at the time had tried to place the blame on a group of low-level technicians who had done nothing wrong. Connor had been the only person in that building who refused to sign a falsified report, even though it meant risking his own job. Evelyn had read the file afterward. She had never forgotten his name. In the years since, Connor had continued to flag safety concerns even when it frustrated managers who wanted problems to disappear quietly rather than be documented. "You were the only person in that building who ever proved he was willing to lose something for telling the truth," Evelyn said. "That doesn't mean you should have pulled me into this," Connor answered. She understood. She was not asking him to investigate anything. She only needed him to hold on to a small flash drive currently tucked inside the pocket of her jacket. If anything happened to her, he was to deliver it directly to Grace Walker, the company's head of legal affairs. Connor did not like the idea. He was an engineer, not a bodyguard or an investigator. More importantly, he was a father, and he made it clear he was not willing to risk his safety for a fight over corporate power that had nothing to do with him. Evelyn did not push back. "You shouldn't have to," she said. That answer, more than anything else she had said, changed the way Connor saw her. She was not using her position to pressure him into anything. Connor agreed to hold the drive until morning, when he could pass it along to Grace himself. Before he left the room, Evelyn asked one more thing of him. "Can you stay until the doctor tells me I'm stable?" she asked. Connor looked at the woman who regularly appeared on the covers of business magazines, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated deals worth more money than he would see in a lifetime. For the first time, he did not see a chief executive sitting in that hospital bed. He saw someone who had nearly been seriously hurt and did not have a single family member sitting beside her. Connor pulled a chair closer to the bed. "I'll be here," he said. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the accident, some of the tension left her shoulders. Connor stayed through the quiet hours of the evening, watching the machines beside her bed and thinking about how strange the day had turned out to be. At one point, a nurse came in to check Evelyn's vitals and mistook Connor for family, asking casually how long they had been married. Neither of them corrected the assumption right away, and an odd, brief silence passed between them before Connor finally explained that he was a colleague, nothing more. The nurse apologized and left, and Evelyn, half asleep from the medication, murmured something about how peaceful it was to simply be mistaken for someone ordinary for once, instead of the chief executive everyone expected her to be at every hour of the day. The next morning, the facilities department released a preliminary finding. The bolts holding the support frame had simply worked loose over time. Connor found the explanation impossible to accept. He had personally inspected that exact section of the garage only 2 weeks earlier, and a frame like that could not loosen at multiple points simultaneously on its own. Connor returned to the garage with Grace Walker beside him. The security cameras positioned near the site of the accident had lost exactly 17 minutes of footage, a gap too precise to be accidental. Adrian appeared while they were still examining the area. He suggested, in a tone meant to sound helpful, that an outside investigation team should handle the matter from here. Then he made an offer that seemed considerate on the surface, paid leave for Connor in recognition of his actions the day before. Connor understood exactly what the offer really meant. Adrian wanted him out of the building. Connor declined the leave. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained in the hospital, advised to stay under observation for one more day. News of the accident had already begun circulating through the company, and the board of directors called an emergency session. Adrian told the board that Evermont needed an interim chief executive, since Evelyn was clearly in no condition to run the company. Connor realized the accident had, by pure chance, handed Adrian exactly the opening he needed. Grace examined the contents of the flash drive that evening. Inside were copies of contracts, internal emails, and a payment ledger that raised serious questions. It was not yet enough to prove Adrian had caused the accident himself, but it painted a troubling picture of what he had been hiding. Connor focused on the part of the puzzle he understood best, the mechanics of it. He studied the photographs taken at the scene more closely than anyone else had bothered to. On one of the bolts he noticed fresh tool marks along the threads. This was not the wear of metal fatigue. It had been removed and reinstalled deliberately and recently. It was the first solid indication that someone had tampered with the frame on purpose, and Connor understood that whatever had truly happened in that garage went far beyond a simple maintenance failure. He photographed the marks himself and logged the time, the location, and the exact bolt in question, building a record that could stand up to scrutiny later. Grace warned him to be careful about who he shared the findings with, since word of an active investigation could easily reach the wrong ears inside a building where information moved quickly between departments. Connor thought about the guard who had waved him through the stairwell the night before, and about how few people actually had access to that section of the garage after hours. He began quietly compiling a list of names, cross-referencing badge access logs against maintenance schedules, looking for anything that did not line up. It was slow, careful work, the kind that suited him far better than boardroom politics ever would. He kept reminding himself that his job was to gather facts, not to accuse anyone, and that the truth, once it was fully assembled, would speak for itself far more convincingly than any argument he could make in a meeting. 2 days later, Evelyn was discharged from the hospital, her shoulder still fixed in a brace. Connor picked her up himself, not as a driver but because Grace worried that the company car and its usual driver might be watched. In the car, the two of them talked for the first time outside the pressure of work. Evelyn asked about Connor's life. He gave her only the basics, that he was a single father raising a daughter on his own, and that his family was the reason he never took foolish risks. He kept the details brief and did not linger on it, and Evelyn did not push him further. Evelyn admitted she had never married. After her own father passed away, the company had become almost the entirety of her life, filling every space that might otherwise have belonged to someone else. "It sounds like the company has taken more from you than it's given back," Connor said. Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. It was not something anyone had ever said to her directly. When Evelyn returned to Evermont, she found that Adrian had already assumed nearly complete control on an interim basis. He informed the board that Evelyn required an extended leave of absence, presenting figures that suggested several major projects were falling behind schedule under her leadership. Evelyn pushed back immediately, but a handful of directors were beginning to waver, swayed by the numbers Adrian had prepared so carefully in advance. Connor waited outside the boardroom, not part of the meeting and not expecting to be. But when Adrian described the accident as nothing more than routine maintenance failure, Connor walked in without waiting to be invited. He laid out his technical findings plainly. The bolt had shown clear signs of tampering, and the marks indicated the interference had occurred within 48 hours of the accident. "Are you accusing someone?" Adrian asked, his voice sharp. "No," Connor answered. "I'm saying this accident did not happen on its own." The atmosphere in the room shifted completely, and for the first time, Connor watched several board members turn their attention away from Adrian and toward the evidence on the screen in front of them. Samuel Bennett, the chairman of the board, asked Connor a series of direct questions about the tampering marks and how he had identified them. Connor answered each one carefully, sticking strictly to what the evidence showed and refusing to speculate beyond it, which only made his testimony land harder in the room. Adrian tried to steer the conversation back toward Evelyn's supposed absence and the company's need for stable leadership, but the momentum had already shifted. Samuel asked that the vote on interim leadership be postponed until the safety findings could be properly reviewed by an independent party. Evelyn watched from the doorway, still pale from her injuries but standing on her own 2 feet. She said nothing during Connor's presentation, letting the facts carry the weight instead of her authority, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to believe that the ground beneath her might still hold. Adrian understood that Connor had become an obstacle. The following day, Human Resources received an anonymous complaint, claiming Connor had violated protocol by moving Evelyn himself after the accident instead of waiting for paramedics. Shortly after, a second document surfaced accusing Connor of overlooking a safety violation 6 months earlier, an accusation that had never been raised at the time. Connor was suspended immediately. Pending a formal review, Evelyn was furious, but Connor asked her not to intervene using her authority. "If you protect me just because I helped you, Adrian will say everything I've done has been for personal gain," he told her. Connor wanted the record itself to prove his innocence, without anyone's influence attached to it. Grace examined the disputed documents closely and discovered that Connor's electronic signature had been copied from an earlier file and pasted into the new one. Connor remembered a crucial detail. Only 3 people held the administrative access needed to alter maintenance records after they had been officially closed. One of them was an operations director who reported directly to Adrian. Grace traced the system logs. An administrative account had accessed the safety files the night before the accident, and shortly afterward the same terminal had disabled the garage cameras. Grace warned Evelyn that they were getting close to the truth, but if they released the evidence too soon, Adrian would have time to destroy whatever remained. Evelyn decided to let him believe he had already won. She told the board she might seriously consider the extended leave after all. Adrian took the bait immediately, moving forward with plans to hold a formal vote on replacing her as chief executive the following Monday. While Connor waited out his suspension, he spent the time reviewing every piece of documentation Grace had gathered, cross-checking dates and signatures against the maintenance calendar he knew better than anyone else in the building. He found small inconsistencies that a lawyer might have missed, but that jumped out immediately to someone who had spent years reading equipment logs for a living. At home, his daughter noticed he seemed distracted, and Connor made a point of the whole matter aside during dinner, keeping that part of his life separate from whatever was unfolding at Evermont. It was a discipline he had built over years of practice, one that let him walk back into the investigation each morning with a clear head instead of carrying the weight of it home with him. Grace kept him updated by phone rather than email, wary that even internal messages might not be as private as they seemed. She told him plainly that the operations director tied to the altered files had a personal relationship with Adrian dating back nearly a decade, which explained the loyalty but not yet the full extent of what either man had done. Connor asked her directly whether she believed Adrian had ordered the tampering himself, and Grace admitted she did not know for certain. What she did know was that the evidence, once assembled properly, would leave the board with very few places left to look away from. On Monday morning, the board gathered for the vote. Adrian arrived with the confidence of a man who already believed the company was his to run. Connor, still suspended, had no right to attend. Just as the vote was about to begin, Grace requested the floor for an urgent legal matter. Evelyn walked in behind her. Her shoulders still ached, but her posture had returned to the composed, unshakable presence the board remembered. Grace displayed the system logs on the screen. The account used to alter Connor's file belonged to a manager who reported directly to Adrian. After being assured he would face no consequences for cooperating, that manager admitted Adrian had personally instructed him to erase the garage's camera footage. Adrian denied ever ordering the accident itself, and the evidence did not prove he had. What it revealed instead was that Adrian had ordered the cameras disabled to hide a secret meeting with a supplier involved in a separate contract fraud scheme. Another employee, terrified that Evelyn would uncover safety reports tied to that same scheme, had tried to quietly remove a sensor and had accidentally weakened the support frame in the process, then hidden the mistake rather than report it. So the accident had never been a plot to harm Evelyn directly. But the chain of fraud, falsified records, and cover-ups running through Adrian's side of the operation had created the exact conditions that led to her injury. Adrian still bore heavy responsibility for what had happened. The board suspended him from his position immediately, and the vote to remove Evelyn as chief executive collapsed before it ever reached the floor. The coup he had spent months quietly assembling had failed in the span of a single meeting. Samuel Bennett called for an immediate independent audit of every contract Adrian had touched over the past 2 years, and several board members who had wavered days earlier now spoke openly about how uneasy they had felt supporting him in the first place. Grace stayed behind after the meeting to begin coordinating with outside counsel, making certain the evidence would hold up under any legal challenge Adrian might attempt. Evelyn did not gloat, and she did not raise her voice once during the entire presentation. She simply stood beside Grace and let the facts do what facts do best, and when the vote against her removal was formally recorded, she thanked the board quietly and asked to move on to the next item of business as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Outside the boardroom, word of what had happened spread through the company within the hour, though Connor heard about it secondhand from a colleague rather than from Evelyn herself. He was still technically suspended, and it would take another full day before his own name was formally cleared. When Grace finally called to tell him the news, Connor was standing in his kitchen helping his daughter with a school project, and he had to step into the hallway to take the call properly. She explained everything calmly: the falsified signature, the disabled cameras, Adrian's suspension, and the collapse of the vote against Evelyn, and Connor found himself gripping the phone a little tighter than he intended as he listened. It was strange, he thought afterward, how relief could feel almost as unsettling as the accusation itself had. Once the review concluded, Connor was fully cleared and reinstated. Evelyn offered him a new position as Director of Safety Integrity. Connor did not accept right away, uneasy at the idea of being rewarded simply for having saved her. Evelyn explained the role was not a reward at all. "You've already been doing this job for years," she said. "We just never gave you the authority that should have come with it." Connor agreed, but only on the condition that the safety department operate independently from the operations division going forward, free from the kind of pressure that had allowed problems to be hidden in the past. Evelyn accepted the condition without hesitation. The weeks that followed settled into a steadier rhythm. The company began to stabilize, and life at Evermont slowly returned to something resembling normal. One evening, Connor happened to see a medical form Evelyn needed to update for an upcoming business trip. He noticed his name was still listed under emergency contact. "Did you forget to change it?" he asked. "No," she answered simply. Connor felt a flicker of discomfort. "You have Grace, you have lawyers, you have an entire board." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I have plenty of people who are obligated to show up if I call," she said. She paused before continuing. "You were the only one who showed up before I even had the chance to ask." The words settled into the space between them, and Connor found he had nothing to say in response. It was not a dramatic declaration, only a quiet truth spoken plainly, and it marked the moment their relationship began shifting from simple gratitude into something with deeper roots, though neither of them rushed to name it out loud. Connor set the form down and changed the subject, asking instead about the audit and how the board was handling the fallout from Adrian's suspension. Evelyn let him steer the conversation elsewhere, sensing that he needed the space, and for the rest of the evening they talked about nothing more complicated than the company's plans for the coming quarter. Still, something had shifted quietly between them, something neither one mentioned again that night but that both of them carried home. Connor found himself thinking about the conversation later, long after he had picked up his daughter and settled into the ordinary routine of his evening, turning Evelyn's words over in his mind the way he once turned over a stubborn piece of machinery, looking for the part that explained why it worked the way it did. 3 months later, Evermont looked like a different company. The independent safety reporting system Connor now oversaw had uncovered several long-buried problems, each one addressed before it could turn into another crisis. Evelyn had changed as well. She no longer stayed in the office every night. She had started delegating more, and she had slowly begun building relationships that did not depend entirely on positions of power. Connor and Evelyn had kept clear professional boundaries throughout the entire investigation. Only after every issue tied directly to their working relationship had been fully resolved did Evelyn suggest meeting outside of work. It was not an extravagant dinner. It was simply coffee on a quiet weekend afternoon, and Connor agreed without hesitation. Months after that first meeting, Evelyn was filling out paperwork ahead of an international business trip. Her assistant asked a routine question. "Is Connor Hayes still listed as your emergency contact?" the assistant asked. Evelyn glanced through the glass wall of her office. Connor stood on the other side of the hallway, deep in conversation with an engineer about a new safety report. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile. "Still Connor," she said. That evening, Connor asked her why she had never changed that name on the form. "At the worst moment of my life," she told him, Everyone else asked me what they should do next. You were the only one who didn't ask, she said. You just stayed. Connor reached over and took her hand. There was no grand declaration of love, no rushed wedding, only two adults who had each carried loss and isolation for years, finally choosing to trust someone else with the weight of it. They left the coffee shop together that evening, walking side by side down the quiet street. Evelyn's phone buzzed once with a work notification, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she turned the screen off without looking at it and kept walking beside him. Behind them, the lights of the city settled into their evening rhythm, cars moving past, storefronts closing for the night. Life continuing exactly as it always had. Nothing about the scene looked remarkable to anyone passing by, just two people walking together after a quiet afternoon. But for Connor and Evelyn, it marked something neither of them had expected to find again, a version of trust built slowly, tested under real pressure, and chosen freely rather than assigned on any form.